and welcome. Thank you for coming to my talk. My name is Josefine. My pronouns are she, her. And in the next couple of minutes, I will be talking about web accessibility and ways in which you can get started today. I would like to start with a brief story of how I got into web development and especially accessibility. So I am from what is called a non-traditional background. In a previous life, I studied languages and communication and worked in online marketing. And then life happened. I did a web development bootcamp and started my first job as a front-end developer in a digital agency. And basically, right after I started my new job, we were facing a challenge with the client I was working for. They had to implement accessibility to comply with all the legal requirements from the different countries they were active in, and that was a pretty big deal because it concerned a large legacy code base, many different stakeholders, and accessibility was a new topic for most people on the project, also experienced developers. For me, that was actually a win-win because, well, everything was new to me, so it didn't really matter what I would learn first. And of course, it's always more fun to learn with your colleagues. And it was really motivating for me to do something I felt had a positive impact for a large community of people. I was lucky to have an amazing bunch of mentors, but I still know what it's like to be overwhelmed by the things that you don't know. So I learned some things in the process that I would like to share with you and hope help you on your journey. I will just get started with a little bit of theoretical background before we get right into the practical things. So what is web accessibility and why is it important? Web accessibility means that tools, technologies, and websites are designed and implemented in a way that people with disabilities can use them and that they can participate equally on the web. It's also a basic human right defined by the United Nations. In the table, you can see some of the many potential user groups. For example, people with all kinds of disabilities or impairments like physical, auditory, cognitive, neurological, speech, or visual disabilities. But web accessibility also benefits people without disabilities. So for example, if you're on a small device like a smartwatch or your phone, or older people with changing abilities due to aging, people who maybe have just a broken arm or lost their glasses, or if you're in bright sunlight and can't really see what's on your screen, or you're holding a baby maybe, or are in an environment where you can't turn up the volume, or have like a slow internet connection, for example. All cases in which web accessibility can be very beneficial. But what does it really look like in practice? So it could mean, for example, providing transcripts or captions for videos, being open to different input methods like mouse, but also keyboard, speech commands, or assistive technologies. Generally, compatibility with different platforms, and things like explaining unfamiliar terms and not just assuming everybody has the same base knowledge. Speaking of unfamiliar terms, in accessibility, there are some terms that come across often, and I just want to get them out of the way so we all know what is meant by them. The first thing you might stumble upon is A11Y, which is sometimes pronounced ally, and that's just short for accessibility, so the 11 stands for the 11 letters between the A and the Y. Then there is the WCAG, which is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. This is like a set of rules or guidelines that are shared internationally, and they define different standards of accessibility with different rules. And the A, AA, and AAA, the last one is the most inclusive and the strictest, you could say. They include documentation and rules to follow if you want to get into web accessibility, and they were created by the WAI, the Web Accessibility Initiative. So now that we know what web accessibility is in really broad terms and why it's important, we can get started. I just want to kick off with a little disclaimer. I will mention some tools, but these are just personal preference. I have no affiliation with them, and there are many other great options out there. And if you have any recommendations, I'd be delighted to learn about them, so please feel free to share. We will get started with Semantic HTML, and here we are basically laying the foundation for all things web accessibility, really. Semantic HTML means nothing else than using the HTML elements for their given purpose. That could, for example, be using an H1 as the main headline and then including the most important information for the site on there, or using an A tag to have a link, or UL for an unordered list. You name it, the list goes on. There are many and sometimes very specific HTML elements. I'm actually continuously being surprised. And so by using them in the way they were intended, we give the page structure rather than just presentation. And of course, you could just use CSS and JavaScript to make the elements look and function the way you want, but there are many good reasons not to do so. So the structure and meaning that provides orientation for screen readers, and they depend on this to navigate the page. Then some elements come with basic default styles and inherent functionalities, such as keyboard accessibility. For example, like that basic button you see on the slide, it has a standard look. You can, of course, override if you want to. It's clickable and you can reach it via the keyboard. So you can use the tab key to get there. You could select it with the return key. These are all things that you would have to implement manually if you didn't use the button element, for example. There are many other good reasons apart from accessibility, which are also in favor of Semantic HTML, you could say. So it helps for SEO performance, it's better on mobile, and it's a lot easier to maintain structured code. It's easier to understand for the developers and easier to maintain. So what can you do today? You could return to your code with semantics in mind and check if there's maybe a more precise element that you could use. It's always worth investigating the intended purpose of, for example, an article and an aside. What's the difference there? How were they intended to use? And what is the one that fits your needs best? And if you've done that, you could check, have you included alt tags? Did you select the correct input type, for example? That's super helpful on mobile. If you ask a user to put in a phone number, for example, and you selected input type number, it directly jumps to the number pad, and it's a lot easier for anybody really to put in their phone number. And things like adding labels are also very helpful. If you've done all that and you're brave, you can turn off CSS in your browser and see what the site looks like. Might not be pretty, but you get the general idea of the structure and the overall look and feel, and that might already give you some clues where there is still wiggle room to improve. Ich muss auch kurz was trinken.
Das war richtig gut bisher. Macht richtig Spaß.
Danke. I will continue with color contrast.
Jetzt nochmal an,
ja.
Während du, also du hast gerade erst abgestellt.
Okay, ja.
Tief atmen und dann wieder los.
Okay. I will continue with color contrast. So both color and contrast are very important for accessibility. We want to make sure that content is perceivable and the contrast between the text and the background is sufficient. If I say sufficient, that means like on the slide in the middle, so 4.5 to 1 is the ratio we need to comply with the WCAG, the standards that I mentioned at the beginning. And we need high contrast for people with visual impairments, and there's something to consider about luminance. So very bright colors can be difficult for people with reading disabilities. That's also something to keep in mind. There's a really cool tool you can use to simulate what different kinds of people might perceive your website as. So it's called the Web Disability Simulator, and you could select here, for example, simulations for site. There's total color blindness, for example. You can select it and then get an impression of what your site looks like for people who cannot perceive colors. There are other options, like, for example, red and green color blindness, which already looks a bit different, or things like if you're in bright sunlight and you need higher contrast to perceive certain things on the website. This is, of course, not very precise, but it's a good place to start and maybe just to double check and keep different kinds of user groups in mind. To make it a little bit more coherent, there are tools like color pickers, for example. I can put in different kinds of colors here. So now you see like a really light blue and the green background is not easy to read. You see I'm failing here all the different levels. I'm not passing the score of 4.5, and it's overall not sufficient. So if I change this to a little bit darker blue, it's already a lot better. I'm now passing the score. It's a little easier to read. Maybe if you would want to do it in the best possible way, there is still some wiggle room, but it's passing the score. It's overall sufficient. And now if I do something like I'm guessing this is black, this is a lot higher contrast, easier to read for most people, and overall just a little bit better user experience. Another thing to keep in mind, you want to make sure that all the aspects of the website you want your users to interact with have high enough color contrast. So things that are often overlooked are like the footnote region, or navigational elements are really important, menus. All of these features need to be visible in order to be usable. And it would be ideal, of course, if color contrast would be considered in the brand colors during the development process. That's not always possible, but it's a good thing to come back to and make sure the contrast is at least near the minimum. We'll already get to the last point, which is keyboard accessible. We'll get to the last point, which is keyword accessibility. It's super important for many different user groups as well. For example, people with motor disabilities, they rely heavily on the keyboard or assistive technologies. For example, also modified keyboards. Blind users also typically rely on keyboards for navigation. And just in general, it's really good user experience because it's a lot more efficient and fast if you can do certain things with the keyboard. There are a couple of aspects to keep in mind. So, for example, you want to make sure users can tap to all interactive elements, and also that they can tap away. So you don't want to trap your user somewhere where they can't get out except they're using a mouse, for example. There are some use cases where maybe like a modal opens up and you want some interaction in there. Those are use cases in which maybe you want to trap your user, but never do it unintentionally unless it's required. Then you want to make sure the tab order, so the way in which you go through the different elements on the site, is logical and follows the general flow of the page. You need focus to be visible, so I need to be able to check which element is currently active. And then I want to make sure that I really have all the functionality by keyboard that I would have otherwise. So something that is often overlooked is something like hover effect. So maybe there's a tooltip with information. I need to make sure this is also accessible if I'm not hovering with a mouse, but rather using a keyboard to navigate. So what could you do? Things are starting to overlap here now because you could use Semantic HTML. That helps a lot. You want to make sure that focus is visible and has enough contrast. So please avoid things like outline none or outline zero, or anything else that removes style or limits visibility of the keyboard focus indicators. If you can't see where your focus is, you could go to the DevTools in the console and type document active element. That should return which element is currently active. And you can, of course, try and navigate only with your keyboard. Go on your favorite websites, see what the user experience is like, and if it really works out. It's a good challenge for an hour or a day, if you feel like it. And then for the tab order, there are some really helpful tools. So for example, in Firefox, in the accessibility tab, you can visualize which element comes in which order and whether you skipped something. Or there are tools like Tab Ally that also really help. They go through your page and give you a hint if something is not really matching up. Yeah, that was already it. That was a very quick overview of the things you can do to get started with web accessibility today. I hope my talk was helpful, and please keep in mind, in the case of accessibility, 10% is better than nothing. It's an ongoing process and every small step counts. If you have any questions about web accessibility or anything else that I covered today, please feel free to reach out, to leave a comment on the CodeLand post in the Code Newbie community, or reach out on Twitter, LinkedIn, or DevTO. I look forward to hearing from you, and I hope you have a great time at CodeLand.